Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Shaw here, ready to go for the 11th through 19th Amendment. In this video, we're also going to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement and kind of some things that happened after the Civil War. So just know that that's coming as well. So anyway, let's get right to it. All right, so we're finished now with the Bill of Rights. Now we're getting into everything that came afterwards. So the Bill of Rights was ratified, I believe it was right around 1791. The 11th Amendment was added pretty close after that. So what was happening is that people were trying to sue states in federal courts. And so that was kind of creating a really big mess between who had jurisdiction. Was it the state court or the federal court? So what they did was they added the 11th Amendment in 1795, and they said that basically citizens can't sue states in federal court. Okay, and again, it prohibits federal courts from hearing cases where a state is sued by someone from another state or country. So again, if you have a problem with a state, you have to take it up in their state courts, and that's basically it. Okay, 12th Amendment was in 1804. Now, again, the first president was George Washington, and he served for 2 terms, so a total of 8 years. So after 1800, after the 1800 election, or 1800? I think it was 1800. Anyway, after George Washington had stepped down, what happened is that under the original Constitution, whoever got first place in the Electoral College was president, and whoever got second place was vice president. So now this was really problematic because it would lead to people who had very different viewpoints, having to work in the same office together. So, and again, that's what happened in 1800. John Adams got first place in the Electoral College, and Thomas Jefferson got second place, and they hated each other. So this was a very big problem and needed to be solved very, very quickly. And so the 12th Amendment came around in 1804, and it changed the way the president and vice president are elected. So now the president and vice president are elected together, okay, by the Electoral College. Okay, and if there isn't a majority, the House of Representatives, 1 vote per state, will decide. Okay, so that's really important again. So that just basically kind of smooths over kind of what happens, or how the president is elected, because we need people, whoever's in that office, we need them to be working together. All right, so the Civil War amendments, the 13th through 15th amendments, and basically what you need to understand is that after the entire Civil War was essentially fought over slavery. Again, some people say it's it was over states' rights. Again, it was the states' right to have slaves. So anyway, so the thing you need to understand is that states sometimes use their reserve powers to pass laws that violated civil liberties. Slavery being one of those major violations of civil liberties that was allowed for, the first 80 or so years of this country's existence, and then many years before that as a colony. So after the Civil War, after the North won, and again the Union was, kind of reunited, there were 3 amendments that were passed to extend civil liberties to African Americans. And that's what these 3 amendments are going to be. So the first one is the 13th Amendment. This was passed in 1865. And it officially outlaws slavery in the United States and freed thousands of African Americans. Now, that sounds really good, but part of the problem is that it has this clause in it that it says it outlaws any sort of forced labor except as punishment for a crime. So now, what that allows a lot of southern states to do is to essentially continue slavery in the prison systems, and so a lot of scholars believe that this is the main reason why African Americans have, especially African American males, have been incarcerated and imprisoned at such higher rates than they exist as a percentage of the population. Because, again, that was a way for them to basically continue that forced labor, even though the 13th Amendment technically outlawed it. Anyway, so that we'll talk more about that later. 14th Amendment was next. So, again, we freed the slaves. Now we need to make them citizens. Okay, so the 14th Amendment defines citizens as anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Again, that word naturalized we've talked about before. That just means the process of becoming a citizen of another country. A couple other things that the 14th Amendment does, it's really, really important. Guys, the 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment besides maybe like the first and then like all of the due process amendments. This one is probably one of the most important ones. So it requires every state to grant its citizens equal protection of the laws. Okay, there's so many court cases that we need to talk about that are going to quote unquote violate equal protection of the laws. Basically, it defines what citizenship is, and then it says that every person, every citizen needs to be equal and have the equal protection of the laws. Okay, it also forbids state governments from interfering with the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Again, we haven't really talked very much about privileges and immunities, but it is one thing that every citizen has. If you are a citizen of one state, you are technically a citizen of all states, and you have the same privileges and immunities of the citizens in any of the 50 states. So that's really important because just move, like under the Articles of Confederation, you could move to one state, move from one state where you were a citizen to a different state, and they might not recognize that citizenship and not grant you those privileges and immunities. So regardless, that was very important to make sure it was included, especially with these newly freed African Americans. Then the last one is that state governments may not take an individual's life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. We have seen this once before. We saw that in the Fifth Amendment, but it was so important because there were, again, with newly freed slaves. Again, this is 3 years later after the 13th Amendment was passed. We were seeing a lot of African Americans and freed slaves that were whose life, liberty, or property were being taken without due process. And so this was important to include in the 14th Amendment to make sure that that was no longer going to happen. Unfortunately, it did essentially until for the next 100 years or so until the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, and the last one is the 15th Amendment, and this was in 1870. So again, we have now freed slaves, we have now granted them citizenship, and now the last one is we need to ensure, pretty much protect their right to vote. So the 15th Amendment says no state may take away a person's voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous enslavement, and then in the actual wording, it's previous condition of servitude. And so this was aimed to guarantee suffrage, which is the right to vote, to African Americans. In reality, it only protected men because women didn't have the right to vote yet. But the problem is that like for many years after this, about 90 years after this, especially in the South, but really it was all over America. People would use things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses and just all kinds literacy tests, things that you guys have learned about in U.S. history to really limit the rights of African Americans to vote. And so we'll talk about these more later, but that is the Civil War amendments. And I want to talk about the civil rights struggle really, really quickly. Guys, you can write this down just because it will help. Again, it might help you understand kind of what was going on. But I'm not super worried about you. You guys have already learned this stuff. So if you know all this, don't feel obligated to write it down. All right, so despite advances from the Civil War, African Americans still face discrimination. Again, I already mentioned this a little bit, but again, we talked about Jim Crow laws in southern states. Again, things like black codes that kind of morphed into Jim Crow laws that really legalizes segregation. And so segregation, as you guys already know, is the social separation of the races. This was basically legalized by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and said that as long as separate facilities are equal, then segregation is constitutional. Again, in the North, Americans fared better. Again, they were able to vote freely in some states. Segregation was less noticeable, although it was still present. And again, that's not, again, so that like they fared better, but it wasn't great. Okay, so that just understand that as well. So this leads us to, again, we're going to kind of flash forward here to 1954, and this is Brown versus Board of Education. Again, segregation was rampant in public schools. Black schools were really, really terrible. Again, people were, if you had, so much money for to build a school as a state or as a city, you would probably, let's say you had $1,000 to build a school. What you would do is you would spend, let's say $700 on the white school and then $300 on the black school. And so we know that these facilities were not equal at all. However, it's just that that was how things were. until Brown versus Board of Education, nobody really tried to challenge that, or if they did, it didn't get to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and they said that it violated the 14th Amendment's principle of equal protection under the law. We are going to talk about Brown versus Board a lot more in class, so I don't want to cover it too much in this video. So just know that this was the decision, and it was very, very important, and we'll talk about kind of what other effects that had later on in class. There were, again, you guys have learned about this, about peaceful protest. Martin Luther King Jr. Believed in nonviolent protest. Again, he organized, along with many, many others, marches, boycotts, demonstrations, sit-ins at lunch counters that served only whites, freedom riders that would ride segregated buses. Again, in 1963 at the March on Washington, he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Again, you guys have learned all this stuff before. Again, this is kind of the context now after the Civil War amendments, kind of what's going on and like what else, how that fight continues. Montgomery bus boycott was the last, I think this is the last thing I have for you. This was in 1955. Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery bus. Basically the local African-American community just organized a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. It was very, very successful. And in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that public bus segregation was unconstitutional. Again, kind of going back to the Brown v. Board decision. Okay. Oh, sorry, I lied. I think this is the last one. Let me see. Yep. Okay. So then all these, civil rights, the civil rights protests and things like that eventually led to what's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is really huge legislation, guys. This is probably one of the most important laws that has ever been passed. And it prohibited discrimination in public facilities, employment, education, and voter registration. It also banned discrimination not only by race and color, but also by sex, gender, religion, and national origin. So this is really, really important, again, and it's just such an important law that this along with its partner, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, really allows for more equality. Again, I won't say true equality because again that fight is still continuing. But this one is kind of what's making up for all of the Jim Crow era is essentially done now. Again, at least in theory, and now it's just the fight for true equality. Okay. Last thing I'm going to cover in this video is the Progressive Era Amendments, which is from the 16th through the 19th Amendments. All right, so a lot of these are pretty straightforward, guys. So the 16th Amendment, again, you have actually already learned about these in U.S. history, so I'm just going to go kind of fast, but I want to make sure to touch on them. So the 16th Amendment, it was in 1913. Now, we know that it is an enumerated power of Congress to be able to tax. The problem is that the way that they were taxing was not super efficient, and it wasn't a major way or a major source of income for them, or a major source of revenue. So the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913 that allowed the federal government to collect income tax directly from citizens. Okay, and again, they can, obviously the government needs to spend a lot of money on different things like the military, roads, bridges, etc. And so that was really important that the government their job is to provide things for us and to protect our safety, and now the 16th Amendment allows them to do that much more efficiently. Okay, the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, and basically originally under the Constitution, senators were elected via state legislatures, okay? And this was super corrupt, okay? And basically if you wanted to become a senator, all you needed to do was just pay off enough people in the state legislature, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're a senator. So again, super corrupt, very, 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 very problematic. And so the 17th Amendment was passed that allowed voters to elect their senators directly. Okay, so now, originally it was just the House of Representatives that was elected directly, but now the senators will also be elected directly by the people. Okay, 18th Amendment is in 1919, and this is prohibition. This is one of the most famous amendments, and it basically bans alcoholic beverages. It bans the sale, transportation, and manufacture or production of alcohol. And again, there's a huge movement during this time called the temperance movement that was trying to ban all, basically it viewed alcohol as like the the devil of society and the cause of all of society's problems. And so it was very, very influential, and it led to the banning of alcohol in America. The 18th Amendment is also famous because it's the only one that's ever been overturned. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Last one is the 19th Amendment. This was passed in 1920. Again, really, really important for women. Again, basically from 1920, going all the way back to like 1787, women did not have the right to vote. There was basically half of the population that was not able to use their voice politically. And so this is obviously very problematic. And so finally in 1920, the women had been fighting for, almost 70 years at this point to get the right to vote. And some states had granted women the right to vote, but they needed it federally to make sure that all states would grant women the right to vote. And so anyway, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton were two very influential women in this movement. And finally, in 1920, women are granted the right to vote. Again, that's also known as suffrage, and we did it. Okay, guys, 11 through 19, I appreciate you. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.